Hail hail and welcome to part 9 of the Celtic History podcast series, which charts the history of Celtic Football Club from 1887 to the current day. In part 8 of the series, titled The Men Who Loved the Green, Chris was joined by Stephen Murray from Celtic Underground, and they covered the period from 1970 to 1980. The club continues its domination from the late 60s into this early part of the decade, with the Quality Street gang developing to one of the greatest teams in Celtic history. We hear from stars of this era, including Bobby Lennox, Dixie Deans, George McCluskey and Alfie Conn, as well as a tribute to the late and great Johnny Doyle. The club continues to challenge in Europe, reaching its second European Cup final in 1970, defeating competition favourites Leeds United home and away on the way to the final. The following season, the club play in a famous European Cup semi-final against Inter Milan, in the same year as a match that changed the face of Scottish football forever. 1974 sees another European Cup semi-final, this time against Atletico Madrid, in a match that is remembered for all the wrong reasons. There are big changes in this decade, with Billy McNeill replacing the great Jock Stein as manager, and the team is required to go through a phase of rebuilding. The Bhoys detail the most famous of league wins in 1979 in the final match of the season. There are details of the playing kit worn in the 1970s, the formation of the Celtic Supporters Trust, all mixed with more fan stories and confessions.
The new decade came along. Celtic were almost at their zenith. I don't think there was a decade in which Celtic were stronger in their history in the 1970s.
Known as the Quality Street gang, Celtic boasted a pool of young players that was unprecedented in its depth of quality.
The 136,000 that turned out that night to see Celtic play Leeds in the old Hampden.
This was the original Battle of Britain.
Beating Leeds United home and away was incredible. That night at Hampden was 135,000.
You're right that Jock Stein and the players underestimated Feyenoord. And Inter Milan, I have to say, I don't think they're the team that had been in the 60s. For two legs, they just defended like hell and got lucky. Dixie was cheered to the rafters that day against Hibs all the way through. That cup final at Hampden against Hibs.
There was also major redevelopment being carried out on the main stand.
From 72 to 76, seen a green collar added to the Celtic home kit and the first piece of shirt sponsorship branding.
Favourite ever Celtic player?
Tommy Burns. Without a doubt, Tommy Burns.
Don't see him as a team, they're part of my life.
Favourite Celtic player of all time is easily Henrik Larsson.
I was one of the founders of the trust and we were the first supporters trust in Scotland.
I'm absolutely delighted to have the hammer of the Hibs, Dixie Deans, on this week.
On the phone this week we had Alfie Conn.
I'm glad to say that on the line I have the one and only George McCluskey.
As Doyle vanished down the tunnel, most observers believed he took Celtic's title hopes with him. Be retiring McNeill's 832nd and final game as a Celtic player.
1975, you've Jock Stein in the car crash, and everything at Celtic changed.
Billy McNeill came from Aberdeen in the summer of 78, and a new era started at Celtic. They finished 79 the way that 70 had started as champions.
And deep in the heart of Celtic support sits the imitable Johnny Doyle from View Park, now known worldwide as simply the man who loved the green.
Now we join Chris McGuigan for part 9 of the series, where he will cover the period of 1980 to 1990 with his guest, author Mr. Douglas Beattie.
It's Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic over all.
Chapter 9, Celtic Football Club, 1980 to 1990. In the UK general election of 1979, the political map of Britain would switch from red to blue as the Conservatives, under leader Margaret Thatcher, swept into power. As a new decade emerged, change was not restricted to the world of politics. Indeed, as Scottish football entered the 1980s, the game was to witness the most significant power shift for a generation and more. On this occasion, it was the Reds who were sweeping to power. In season 1979-80, Aberdeen would claim their first league championship since 1955. Under the guidance of Alex Ferguson, the Pittodrie club pipped Celtic to the Premier Division title by a single point. The Dons snatched the league flag on the final day of the season after Billy McNeill's side, at one time 8 points clear, capitulated during a nightmare run-in. The loss of their title was a bitter blow to the Parkhead men, especially as this had been a campaign which promised much. In Europe, the Bhoys had progressed to the quarter-finals of the European Cup, where they defeated the fabled Real Madrid 2-0 at Parkhead. The Spanish Giants would survive an early scare in the return to claim a decisive 3-0 win. It was a defeat which appeared to derail the Celts for the remainder of the season. But there would be a silver-lined climax to the campaign, as the Hooks lifted the Scottish Cup. George McCluskey's extra-time goal proving to be the winner in a 1-0 final victory over Rangers. Sadly, that achievement would be overshadowed by the infamous events that followed. The sight of a celebrating Celtic team was too much for some Rangers fans to take. The victorious players would have to cut short their lap of honour, as fans of the Ibrox club reacted with alcohol-fuelled rage to their rivals' triumph. The Hampden pitch would resemble a battlefield, as supporters from both sides fought on the turf and clashed with mounted riot police. These images of battling fans would be beamed across the globe. Whatever the issues off the field, on the pitch, Billy McNeill was building a fine side. The experience and class of Danny McGrain was coupled in defence with the solid Tom McAdam. Murdo MacLeod brought power, energy and a genuine goal threat to the midfield, where David Provan proved to be an exciting, well effective winger. Frank McGarvey, a record £250,000 capture from Liverpool, was a hard-working forward and a fine goal scorer. Homegrown talents were also coming to the fore. Comfortable in both defence and midfield, Roy Aitken was an increasingly influential presence. Strong and committed, the sight of Aitken on an unstoppable charge forward was a sight to behold. And youngster Charlie Nicholas seemed to possess perhaps the most exciting new talent in Britain. The striker quickly established himself as a darling of the fans, a supposed style icon off the field. On the pitch, he possessed a wonderful touch and an eye for goal. Nicholas played with a crowd-pleasing swagger, which was fully justified by his sublime ability on the ball. A supreme entertainer, there was, however, no doubting that Nicholas had an end product. Then there was a boy from McCoughton, Tommy Burns. When it came to his love for Celtic, Tommy wore his heart on his sleeve, but Burns was more than just a supporter in a jersey. He had curtailed a quick and fiery temper to mature into a player of considerable class. At a time when Scotland was blessed with many fine midfielders, Tommy Burns was among the very best. Alex Ferguson at Aberdeen and Jim McLean at Dundee United had constructed excellent teams. But a talented Celtic side were not so easy to knock from their pedestal. While cup form was disappointing, the Bhoys regained the championship in season 1980-81, and they then sealed back-to-back titles by leading the 1981-82 Premier Division from the first day to the last. That latter triumph would be dedicated to the memory of winger Johnny Doyle. A man defined by Billy McNeill as a true Celt, Johnny would die on the 19th of October 1981 following a tragic accident when he was electrocuted at his home in Kilmarnock. Although no longer a first-team regular, the 30-year-old had remained a hugely popular figure among the support. Quick, tenacious, and a fine dribbler, Johnny was a wholehearted proud Celt. He had lived the dream and cherished every minute. Johnny would be greatly missed by all.
It's Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic over all.
Okay, welcome to Chapter 9 of the Celtic History Podcast, and on the line tonight I have Douglas Beattie, who everybody will probably remember from his books The Rival Game, The Little Book of Celtic, and my personal favourite, Happy Birthday Dear Celtic. Douglas, how are you?
I'm very well, Chris. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks very much for having me on. It's a great honour and a great pleasure, I must say.
So we're going to have a little chat this evening about the mighty 80s, and why I'm really looking forward to this is I remember the 80s.
Yeah, well, likewise, Chris, and I think we're of a kind of similar age, and we were there and we lived it, and I was thinking actually, it feels like a long time ago. and there's a good reason for that. It is a long time ago. I think guys who were watching Celtic in the late 50s, let's say during Jock Stein's playing days, the 1980s were a great leap into the future for them. Well, guys watching Celtic now, the 1980s are like the 1950s for them. It's that far back. Football has changed and Celtic Park has changed, and the world goes around and the game keeps going. And thankfully, we're still around to talk about it. So that's a great period. But I loved it.
Douglas, you're making me feel awful old here, so you are, because I'm looking down through my notes and I'm going, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, that's it. That's
ancient history, I remember.
I know. It feels a wee bit like that at times, but some of it, hopefully, is still fresh in the mind, Chris.
Well, if the 80s wasn't intriguing, I don't know what was intriguing, because this is the period where... I think I smiled more during the 80s, and I shouted more and I cried more during the 80s than any other time. And we can talk about the 90s all we want, but see the 80s, I had a blast in the 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, purely from a Celtic point of view, that's my introduction to Celtic. It's when I started going to games. I never stopped going to games, but you always remember, a bit like your first Doctor Who, you always remember the start. You always remember when you first went. And you can be brought up in stories of Celtic or football generally, or any club that might be. Celtic are a special club. We all know that, of course. But it's when I first went. It's when you first went. And goodness me, it was really a decade, I think, of great highs and great lows, last gasp stuff, and drama of incredible proportions peppered, I think, throughout. And we were talking just before we started, and I think it's worth mentioning again. Celtic in the 1980s, it seems to me, if you look at it through the prism of the late 60s and most of the 70s, the 80s seems like a decade of kind of mediocrity, a sort of fall from grace, slowly but surely. Look at it from the hell of the 90s, you look back at the 80s, and it looks like a decade of triumph. And at times it was. But there were a few lows and a lot of changes that I'm sure we'll talk about that go along with that. So it's an intriguing decade, I think, Chris, for lots of reasons, on and off the park,
The one thing that I remember from the 80s was, as a little boy in Belfast, and, all my pals were Man United supporters and Liverpool supporters and all this here kind of stuff, I was still a Celtic supporter, and there was enough to keep me a Celtic supporter. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does, because as I say, I think the drama just kind of kept ticking along, and I think probably growing up in Belfast, Celtic are always there in the background, no matter if the English team you support is your main team. Slightly different for me. I grew up in a small town in the Scottish borders, which was overwhelmingly populated by Rangers supporters, but there was a Celtic bus that grew in size, that was run out of the town every weekend, really. And from about the age of 12 or 13, I wanted to go. I asked my mother to spend every weekend if I could go. And until I was about nearly 14, she didn't let me go, because going to Glasgow was a big deal. But going to Celtic Park then is very different to going to Celtic Park now, Chris. Sure. I remember walking in at the Janefield end, paying money at the gate. And you remember this too, I'm sure. You can walk in there, walk right around the grounds, around the curve of the Janefield, into the jungle, that dark, foreboding enclosure, wonderful atmosphere, that you would never forget. If you were a Martian arriving on Earth and you'd stood there for 5 seconds, you would think it was, the greatest experience of your life. And then you walk around the London Road end, and you could walk all the way around, having paid at the Janefield. And fans of today would simply just not recognise that as football. And there was a culture at Celtic Park of... songs were being sung about Ireland. Songs were being sung about all manner of things that challenged authority, that showed me that there was a culture going on there that I just simply wasn't aware of. I went to see Celtic because, they were I loved the strips, I loved the name, I loved I saw them on television, these great sweeping attacks that they had, men with sort of chiseled hair and beards. So I think they were just fascinating to me. But it was a magical thing to go at the beginning of the 80s.
throughout the 80s, you know, as I grew up as a teenager, and you start to become politically aware of what's going on in the world as well. And that whole undercurrent, you know, from the mid 80s right up to modern day, it was then that you realised that Celtic was more than Kenny Dalglish and Danny McGrain and Charlie Nicholas. You know, there was the fashion at the time, there was a music at the time, there was the politics at the time, and the 80s was a fantastically exciting time to be a Celtic supporter.
No, it absolutely was. And I think on lots of different levels, Chris. I mean, you had things like just about every single band coming up to Scotland, and probably Ireland too, that was cool, were Celtic supporters. Every artist, everybody involved in any kind of creative industry in these regions, these areas, these countries, were Celtic supporters, because Celtic has a link, I think, to the underdog, as Billy McNeill has talked about a lot, you know, about a culture that has been squeezed and marginalised for a long time, but is kind of left-leaning. And in the 80s, of course, a hugely tribal time in British and Irish society, where you had to choose sides. And that's not the case, or it hasn't been the case up until about now, I think, in British society. Things may be changing. But no, I remember going to Celtic Park, and as I say, you know, songs from long ago in Ireland were being sung, but songs about the current political situation as it was then in Ireland were being sung. And there was a real challenge to the cultural norms through fashion, through music, through politics, about Scotland and about Ireland, you know, about the Thatcher decade and about what was happening in Ireland too. It was, you know, from someone who was coming from a small town in the Borders, I say again, it was a huge eye-opener to be at Celtic Park. It was, in many ways, a really big part of my education. And I say that because it made me think about things. You know, it challenged the norms of the society I'd grown up in.
And that's what's fantastic about these history podcasts as well, because yes, we're talking about a club, but we're talking about something so much bigger, and how it affected just general ordinary day boys and girls like us. You know, and you think we're talking about the 80s here. You know, 1981 with the hunger strikes in Belfast. You know, we had the strife right out through the 80s, and that old adage, you know, when we had nothing, we had Celtic. When they talked about Belfast Celtic, it was exactly the same for Glasgow Celtic.
I'm glad to say that on the line I have the one and only George McCluskey, who played for Celtic from 1975 to 1983. He scored 78 goals from 204 games. So I've got a question from Des Brownlee, who is up in the Manhattan Club in New York, and he sent me this via the Huddle board, and he says, does George feel proud of himself knowing that 2 of his goals caused rats, and the reason drink was banned from the football in Scotland? And what was his favourite of the rat goals? Was it goal number 1, the Hampden rat against Rangers and the total ban of drink at the games in Scotland, or goal number 2, the winner against Ajax in Amsterdam, where the Ajax fans started causing mayhem and a mini rat ensued at the Olympic Stadium?
I remember both very vividly. The Ajax one was very important. It was scored at the right time with 2 or 3 minutes to go, and Celtic had a massive crowd over there, and it was a fabulous night for us. Thoroughly enjoyed that, but I have to say that the Hampden night was a lot better.
Were you guys aware that the rat was going on?
To be honest with you, we didn't know anything that was happening. Somebody had put a big daft hat in my head, and we were all kind of having a laugh and thingy, and people were jumping on you, and then this big copper says to me, get off the park. I says, are you joking, Mundra? He says, get off the park, look behind you. And I turned round, and it was like the OK Corral. And I says, I'm out here. There was half the people from View Park and Birkinshaw where I stay, it was on the pitch.
Aye, right enough. That day, the Celtic team really was a fabulous team. You know, when you looked at you know, Proven and Frank McGarvey, Danny McGrain, Murdo McLeod, all the classics from that era. You know, how good was it playing on a team like that, George?
It was great. It was. I'll tell you what was really good about it. There was a lot of camaraderie about the team. Everybody was in it for each other, and and that helped. And it helped the fact that you're playing with good players. You know, I think that team was the last Celtic team to get to the quarter-final of the European Cup, and we get kicked off the park in Spain.
Yeah.
But that was great. It was great to play with great players, and every day was a challenge at training. You know, you were playing with great players, and you improved. I think you improved your game with playing with them.
That's absolutely right. You talk about these momentous political events, and again, Celtic does this. It makes you think. So, think for instance, I know you probably want to talk a bit about the game, but the 1980 Scottish Cup final, which, of course, thank goodness we won extra time. But after that, the thing that people remember the game, that dusty, sunny Saturday afternoon, not a great game. Persky scoring a winner, a bit of a kind of, McGrain hitting it, everybody, the players knackered on the pitch, really tired, and bobbles in off McCluskey, that kind of thing, off they go, Celtic win the cup, joyous scenes, and there's a riot that follows. Now, putting that to one side for a second, that's none of Celtic's fault, in my opinion, the riot. But what's interesting about it is, the police used tactics there through their own negligence, when the horses came onto the pitch using batons. It was the first time batons had been used in Scotland, probably in the British mainland, in fact, since the 1926 general strike.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Celtic fans remember that because they're interested in their history. No other fans of any other club would even make that as a note. But we're interested in the political, the social, the cultural, and the footballing history of the club and the land. So that's a remarkable statistic in itself, to think about that. 1926 is linked directly to the 1980 Cup final. That's part of the tapestry of Celtic.
Okay, we're going to talk about the Scottish Cup final in a minute. We're going to kick off with where we were in 1980. We were following on from 10 men winning the league and all that kind of stuff. And probably the most significant thing about 1980 was the fact that Celtic lost the league. Aberdeen didn't win it. Celtic lost it because we were 8 points clear.
Yeah.
And it ended up not being champions.
Yeah. I think in 1980 there's a reason for that, though, Chris. I think it goes back to something that happened in, off the top of my head, February, I think it's March of 1980, with the Real Madrid ties in the quarter-finals of the European Cup.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a very inexperienced young Celtic team had won in a great match at Celtic Park. McCluskey and Doyle, a 2-0 win. We take that to Madrid. The Bernabeu is absolutely jam-packed. Now, it's a late afternoon match, sort of sunny there, and really intense atmosphere. There was a lot of questions about the referee, Chris, that you may know, and Billy McNeil, had wondered about this ref, and he seemed, a little bit flaky. Celtic turned out in an all-green kit, Real Madrid in all white. They had Stilica was playing for them, Del Bosque was playing, and basically they ran away in a 3-0 lead because they scored just before half-time, and there were some fairly dubious decisions. Anyway, it was a good side, don't get me wrong, Laurie Cunningham, they were a good side, Real Madrid. But Celtic never really recovered from that. The 3-0 loss in Madrid really kicked their confidence in. And the league lead slipped thereafter, and we were left with a tilt at the Scottish Cup.
But these were still days, Douglas, whenever Celtic supporters still kind of, sort of, expected Celtic to win another European trophy.
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's a very good point. What I would say about that is I think this is the beginning, although we wouldn't recognise it then, I think this is the beginning of the end of that period where Celtic were the dominant, or one of the dominant sides in European football. So throughout the 70s, and certainly from 66 on 67, of course, onwards, was great European power. And by the beginning of the 80s, I think through lack of investment and lack of foresight, and the conveyor belt not quite working in the way it had done with the Quality Street Kids in the 70s, you start producing great players. People like George McCluskey, we've talked about, for one, is a super player for Celtic, but there is not sufficient quality in depth there. And that, I think this will be a theme that we'll see throughout the 80s, that, you know, we're moving away from being a first-rate European power to becoming, in all honesty, a second-rate European power. And we would look back at the beginning of the 80s, from the end of the 80s, and clearly see that in a way that we wouldn't in 81, 82, 83, frankly.
But you're saying there about some of the players that came through. We still had a lot of talent in the ranks. But Celtic never really bought big players.
No, they didn't. And I think, again, that was very much the way the board wanted to operate. And I've talked to people who were on that board, and I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. The chairman of Celtic towards the end of that decade, Jack McGinn, made a comment to me about a lack of investment when they were talking about the book that I wrote about the 88 season, the Centenary season, Happy Birthday Dear Celtic, which you mentioned. And he basically said, look, we didn't have the money to spend. I've talked about this a lot. He said, we didn't have the money to spend, and it just wasn't there. You know, they didn't make that point at the time, the board, of course. They wouldn't be as daft as that, but they didn't have the money to spend. And the rationale was that they would always find a Charlie Tully. They would always find Patsy Gallagher. They would always find a diamond in the rough. Someone they could get very cheap who would be absolutely brilliant. And what we couldn't see, I think, in the 80s, the board, was that football was changing, that money was starting to dictate the way players and the game moved. And they were no longer able to replicate the success of the past based on that model. To some extent, we got players through. McCluskey would be one. Paul McStay is another obvious player, and Charlie Nicholas with him. You know, but what I would say about the 80s is, I think Celtic were great going forward, especially. We could buy people like Davy Provan and Murdo MacLeod in the late 70s, who would still be good players in the 80s. You know, very good players. And going forward, they were fantastic. But I think there was a lack of investment, especially at the back, which was Celtic's undoing throughout the decade, really.
The 1980s saw Glasgow try to reinvent itself. Seen by many as a hard-drinking and gang-ridden city, an image hardly helped by the riot that followed the Scottish Cup final of 1980 and saw alcohol banned from football matches in Scotland, the Glasgow's Miles Better campaign was launched in 1983 by the Lord Provost Michael Kelly. The campaign was regarded as a success, and Mr Happy of Mr Men fame is still an image associated with the city to this day. Kelly was, of course, a member of one of the families in control of Celtic, and the fact he was now in such a high position in the city was testament to how far things had progressed in the century since the founding of the club. There were still changes in the east end of the city too. In 1985, new turnstiles were installed for the jungle in the West Terracing, while the pitch was given undersoil heating for the first time. The following year, the West Terracing was finally re-roofed to ensure total cover of the standing area rather than just the rear. With the East Terracing already fully covered, Celtic Park finally had shelter for all. In 1976, the Parkhead Forge had closed its gates for the final time. The steel works had stood to the north of the Gallowgate since 1837, and indeed a rail link into the forge had passed by the west of the stadium and across London Road. However, with the demise of the industry throughout the country, the forge was no longer needed. The Glasgow East Area Renewal Scheme was founded in that year, but it would take a decade of work before plans for the site could be put into place. The railway bridge across London Road may have been rendered obsolete by the closure of the forge, however, it still remained a feature of the area immediately around Celtic Park for years to come. You could often find programme sellers sheltering underneath it from the weather. However, having outlived its primary function, the bridge was finally demolished in 1983, making way in the name of progress. 5 years later, the Forge Shopping and Retail Centre was ready to open, so named to remember the importance of the site that it was built on. With the Gateway supermarket, which was the largest of its kind at the time, an in-shops area and a large Littlewoods, they were joined by a further 40 units and a multiplex cinema. With Celtic Park's floodlights visible from the car park, the new pyramid-shaped entrances finally showed some real investment in Glasgow's East End. further afield, Glasgow hosted its first exhibition in 50 years as Plantation Quay was transformed into the site for the 1988 Glasgow Garden Festival. The third of 5 such festivals in the UK, running from April until September and the only one to be held in Scotland, the 17-acre site had such attractions as a Coca-Cola roller coaster, the Clydesdale Bank Tower and 5 vintage trams. A new footbridge across the Clyde joined the site to the Scottish Exhibition and Conference Centre on the north side of the river. The SECC itself had opened in 1985 and continues to play a large role in the city, while the Bells Bridge is one of the few remnants of the 1988 festival. But one feature of the festival also celebrated the centenary of Celtic, with a floral representation of the special badge worn on the jerseys of the double winners. The front door of Celtic Park also underwent a makeover for the club's 100th birthday. To celebrate the club's centenary season, a new red brick facade was built, including a glass-fronted entrance foyer, as well as new hospitality suites and executive boxes. Despite the banning of alcohol at sporting venues in Scotland just 8 years earlier, a drinks licence for the hospitality suites was also granted following Celtic's assurances that alcohol would only be permitted in certain areas. Despite the changes to the facade that had greeted visitors at the front door of Celtic Park, not everything was lost. The famous Celtic FC glass mosaic that had stood over the doorway was retained and is still proudly displayed within the walls of Celtic Park's main stand. If Glasgow had entered the decade needing to rebrand itself, then it left the decade on a high, as 1990 saw the city named as a European City of Culture. It was the first time such a title had been awarded to a non-capital city, and while the title may have been subject to ridicule by the locals and even by the popular Govan-based TV comedy Rab C. Nesbitt, those in charge of the city were rightly proud of how much had been achieved to lift the city's image. Glasgow was once again a place for people to visit. Unfortunately, Celtic's transformation on and off the park was still to come.
You know, Celtic won the championship in 1981 and 1982. But after that, they started to struggle a little bit for a few years.
Yeah, I think that's true, broadly speaking. I mean, there was lots of... Again, this is a situation where you have Celtic winning the league on the last day of the season, or winning at Tannadice in 81, winning the league on the last day of the season against St Mirren in 82. You've got Charlie Nicholas and Nargin. And everything looks great. Everything in the garden is rosy. But Nicholas breaks his leg, and it starts to look as if the relationship between Billy McNeill and the board, really especially the chairman at the time, Desmond White, is strained, you know? And I think that again stops our progress, because McNeill is worried about a lack of investment in the squad. He's worried about a lack of investment in the ground. He doesn't have a contract, and he knows for a fact, and I'm not sure if younger fans, or even fans who were around at the time that we were aware of this, he knows for a fact that the managers of Aberdeen and Dundee United, but also Rangers, who were a spent force in the 80s, have been paid more than he is. Mm-hmm. So there are obvious tensions there. And even though McNeill is seen as the embodiment of the club, even though in every season, between 78 and 83, towards the end of his tenure, Celtic won a major honour, he's not really been given enough of a say, enough of a strong hand to play, enough investment, and it's really a case of McNeill's ambition and the board's ambition not matching up. McNeill as manager in that period, that early period of the late 70s and the early 80s, wanted Celtic to be not just a force at home, but a strong force in Europe. And the board just couldn't see that, I think, frankly, you know. It's a sadness to say that, but I think it's absolutely right.
But you're absolutely right there, Douglas, because during that period, right up until Billy McNeill leaves in 1983, Celtic, after 1983, Celtic don't talk about Europe anymore. They aren't a force. With the Ajax match was probably the last time that Celtic were a big force in Europe, up until the Martin O'Neill years. And we're then sort of talking about the UEFA Cup. But that Ajax game was probably the last time we were in something huge in Europe.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And just to recap a wee bit, we in December '82, we won the league in the League Cup, in torrential rain at Hampden, and again things look good. Nicholas is at his sublime best. McLeod is running the midfield. It's the first time we won it since 1974. But a month earlier, we'd beaten Ajax 4-3 in aggregate. A good Ajax side, remember this. Johan Cruyff, at the end of his career, was playing on that side and was still, by all accounts, the Celtic team of that time still, that Cruyff was magnificent. Mm-hmm. And again, Jordan McCluskey, someone who, not forgotten about, but much underrated, I think, gets the win in Amsterdam. Right? And I think, much as you were suggesting, that's our last great European performance for many years. And you're quite right, it's a good way of summing it up. We don't talk about Europe anymore in that period. We talk about matching Aberdeen, who are the emerging force. And we're still going head-to-head with a Rangers side that's struggling. It's got people like Bobby Russell and Robert Pritz. They're not a great Rangers team. But one thing that just to back up slightly, George McCluskey made it very clear. I shared stage with him and Frank McAvenny a year or so back, in which it was an open mic. I was talking about the Centenary season in particular, and they were just talking about Celtic memories. George McCluskey made it very clear that he never wanted to leave Celtic. Never wanted to go to Leeds. But Leeds were paying him 3 times, or maybe 4 times actually, what he was being offered as a new contract at Celtic Park. And that again speaks to this thread that we've talked about, this lack of ambition. McCluskey was very emotional talking about this. And anyone who knows George will tell you that he's a big, strapping guy, he's full of fun, likes a laugh, is pretty gallus, they would say in Glasgow. But he was getting quite emotional in front of people he didn't know, Celtic supporters, when he was asked to think back to why he left Celtic. And he's been a coach there for a while, dealing with the under-13s and stuff, and I think he's just happy to get back where he feels he belongs,
Mm-hmm. So he actually lost... One of my favourite memories of the 80s was beating Rangers 4-2 on the last day of the season. And if anybody goes back and watches the videos of this game, Rangers were winning 2-0 and Celtic came back to stuff them 4-2 at Ibrox. And you can see all the Rangers fans all celebrating because Dundee United won 2-1 at Danes Park to win the league.
True.
But what a magnificent display it was that day by the Celtic team, and particularly by Charlie Nicholas.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make a good point again, Chris. Just see it in isolation now if you're watching it on something like... ubiquitous YouTube, just see in isolation, you think that's a great victory for Celtic. And actually taken just as a football match, purely in isolation, it was, and it is. But again, the sadness is here that we're hammering Rangers. Great comeback. Nicholas scores 2 penalties. It's absolutely brilliant on the day. But he's on his way out of Celtic to Arsenal. Through lack of ambition, again, they're losing one of the great talented players of the second half of that century at Celtic. He could have been a Celtic great, but in my pocketbook of Celtic, he doesn't come in my top 10 great Celtic players. Mm-hmm. Principally because he leaves, and I don't think you can put an absolutely brilliantly talented player like Charlie Nicholas in front of someone like, for instance, Danny McGrain, who plays 600 odd times for Celtic and gave absolutely everything for the cause of year after year after year, and was an absolutely world-class fullback.
We seek him here, we seek him there, never to find is very rare.
Henrik Larsson. Well, what he did for the club over the 7-8 years that he was there, also the fact that he could have chosen to go down south to sign for possibly Man United, and he chose to stay with us when we actually were struggling a little bit under the sort of John Barnes, Douglas axis, but he stayed, and the rest is history.
The Timberloy is found in every street in every town, 'cause he's a dedicated follower of Celtic. Oh yes he is.
My favourite place in Celtic Park is the Old Main Stand. basically that came about when I was going to the games, either the jungle, Celtic end, the Rangers end terraces. I'd lost count of the amount of times I'd arrive half an hour before a game, perfect spot, only to find 2 minutes before kick-off you're looking at the back of somebody's back. Being 5'6" is very hard to see. Better viewing than the main stand and easier access to and from the stadium, missing out on some of the mayhem and Janefield Street and that.
Town is where he's bound to watch the famous hoops, 'cause he's a dedicated follower of Celtic. Throughout the years, we've had our times.
My lowest moment, I don't even know if it would be disappointment, it's probably depression. Lowest moment was the Raith Rovers League Cup final, and there's a whole host of reasons for that. Everything about it was just so wrong, and at one point it looked so good. The way in which the game was lost in penalties, and Paul McStay missing the penalty, it was gut-wrenching. I'm a distant connection to the McStay family. As a Lanarkshire boy, I really took it to heart, and basically my heart went out to Paul. It was great how the fans rallied round him at Easter Road the following game.
Oh yes he is, oh yes he is. County Clare to Singapore of China.
My biggest disappointment whilst following Celtic is Helicopter Sunday, or so to speak Black Sunday, whatever you want to call it. When we went to Firth Park, final game of the season, to clinch the league, all we had to do was win, and obviously everybody knows the story. Scott McDonald scoring twice in the second half after us having a 1-0 lead at half time through Chris Sutton. It was hard to take. Walked to the stadium, and I live quite close to Morrow, and we went out, and I think I got on a bus and headed up to the pub. I think we'd as usual, we'd down our sorrows that night, but that was absolutely horrendous.
Dedicated followers of Celtic.
You said Dundee United won the league, and of course they did, and that in itself is an incredible achievement. Even more so, the fact that they did it using only 12 players. Can you imagine? You can't even begin to imagine a team doing that these days, and that tells you again what a different era we're living in now. 12 players win the league at Dens Park and walk down the street to Tannadice and are politely applauded in. Yeah, it's an incredible achievement. And likewise Aberdeen. These were the guys who they had Alex Ferguson as manager and a great scouting network, picking up all the young guys from Glasgow like Joe Miller, who would eventually play for Celtic, John Hewitt, people like that. These were the guys who had vision in the 80s, who could see where football was going, were getting the best out of players, and the new film have come and they've gone, but goodness me, they made the 80s all the more intriguing for being there, I've got to say.
But you look at even between 83 and right up to 87 when Souness comes back to Rangers, all the big games that we're going to talk about involve Dundee United and Aberdeen, and you have to remember that Dundee United are playing in the European Cup at this stage. They're playing Barcelona's and Aberdeen are in the European Cup Winners' Cup, and
beating Real Madrid in the final. I mean, even in Scotland, no one really expected Aberdeen to do that. And people forget also they won the Super Cup.
That's right.
That's why they've got legitimately have 2 stars on their badge. Unlike some other teams, but you know what? No, not quite. But it was remarkable, but again, I say, Celtic, with their capacity, with their support, although it must be noted at this point that attendances, Chris, between about 83 and 86, 87, got as low as 6,000. I think 6,000 against Dumbarton was the lowest it got. And at times we're averaging about sort of 13 to 18,000. The fans had lost belief at times, I think, that it was worth coming along to watch teams that could be great on their day and at other times could be humdrum. But again, you only see this looking back many years, and you can judge it for what it is, because we look at the current example, where we have a stadium that, you know, is full or foolish most of the time, and taking on the likes of Barcelona and winning. You know, it's a different era in different ways.
So this emergence of the new firm, as they call them, being Dundee United and Aberdeen, created something that Celtic were still holding on to. Celtic still were there or thereabouts for a while in the mid-80s. As you say, Rangers they're off the chart. Rangers are done.
Yeah, I mean, I knew a Rangers supporter who was at a game. I couldn't tell you which season it was, but it would be about 84, 85. And they were playing Motherwell on the last day of the season, and they had to beat Motherwell, or maybe get a point, but I think they had to beat them to qualify for Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And the Rangers fans, there's very few of them in the ground again, something like sort of 6,000 to 8,000 at Ibrox, were singing, we shall not improve. You know, but the one thing I would say about Rangers in that era is that they did have the vision thing, and there's a good reason for it, the Ibrox disaster, of course, but they, at a time when no one else was doing it, long before Hillsborough, long before the Taylor Report, anything like that, they had built a new stadium. They had that in their back pocket. They had an all-seater stadium. They were fit for purpose in the modern era. Not financially, not what they wanted to start doing towards the end of the 80s and into the 90s, and certainly from 2000, in terms of taking financial gambles, but they were fit for purpose in terms of a stadium. You know? Really. We weren't. We were miles off that. So, yes, Rangers were a spent force on the park, but they were clearly doing other things that were the system.
Just a little tidbit of trivia for you here. So Celtic never lost the Rangers at home from 1978 to 1989.
Yeah. I remember this. You know, and that was a record that they were pretty determined to protect. It was almost a shock when Celtic lost at Celtic Park against Rangers. So it was, you know, it was kind of like that. You thought, well, you know, that's that record gone. It was remarkable, but good. You know, it was a lot. It was quite a remarkable statistic over a number of years.
So finally, Big Billy leaves. Billy McNeil leaves in June 1983 after a bit of a wrangle over transfer funds. You know, he's watched Charlie leave and stuff like that. And also, at the time, he was told to fire John Clark. Yeah, because the board wanted to bring in Frank Connor, the former Celtic goalkeeper, in Clark's stead. Now, I don't really know, if I'm honest, the exact reason why they wanted to get rid of Clark and bring in Connor. I mean, it surely is the manager's prerogative to choose his assistant. But I don't know. I think in a sense, what we should say about McNeil, you may have stuff you want to say about John Clark, but what we should say about Billy McNeil, of course, is this, as you can imagine, was an incredible shock to the support. It was one thing to lose Charlie Nicholas. Players had come and gone, like Kenny Dalglish. Nicholas had gone, another great talent. He'd not been there anything like as long. And that's one thing. But to lose someone who the fans saw as being the epitome of Celtic, a manager who'd taken over from the great man Steen himself, and they expected to be around for a long time. A manager who, as we've said, had won a major trophy every year, had gone. And that left a huge, huge hole. And the reason he'd gone is because, as I said earlier, he wanted desperately for Celtic to be a success. And the board were prepared, I think, in engineering or allowing McNeil to leave, to say very clearly to the support, we are prepared to put our interests before the interests of Celtic. Yeah. Because clearly McNeil had Celtic's best interest at heart. He was trying to tell them, frankly, what they needed to do. And I think it's at that point, Chris, that the relations between the board and the fans changed. They never recovered. I think it's at that point that some fans, not all, not even a sizable minority, but some began to realise that things had to change at Celtic because they were changing elsewhere. And there was the fracture there that McNeil had gone.
welcome Anton Rogan.
Thank Chris, thank you, son.
Here, you're a hard man to get hold of, do you know that?
I know that. People have been telling me that for years, mate, but it's the way I am, and I got hold of me, it suits me sometimes.
And was there anybody in particular that sort of looked after you when you moved?
Big Paggy was brilliant. To be fair, most of them are lovely, do you know what I mean? But as I say, everyone's different.
The club still sort of had that sort of family atmosphere about it in those days.
Oh, Jesus, it was... You wouldn't believe, Chris, it was like, you know, as I say, when I said you used to walk through that front door and the ticket office was just on your right, if you remember. Right. As soon as you walk through the ticket office, you're in the changing rooms, basically. So it was unbelievable. And you'd think this was only, 20 odd years ago?
I know.
And it was like Victorian times, if you understand. It was, you know, it was just so surreal, and the way it was, the way they set it all up. But then obviously they put the extension on the front, you know. That was the first phase, and then all of a sudden the ground's magnificent now, you know.
I think the way they describe it now is it had charm.
It was only a little bit, though. it wasn't laced with it. My first game was in, I think it was the 3rd of January. Rangers just beat us 2-0, I think, in the New Year's Day game.
Mm-hmm.
And my first game was against Hamilton at Academicals at home. I think it ended up 7-3 or something like that. I would beat them 7-3, but that was my first game. And Davy was still the manager, because then Davy got the sack and Billy came in, you know. Were
the players disappointed to see Davy going, or was the fact
I think a lot of them were.
Yeah?
Because it's like everything, Chris. There's different people in life, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
Davy's alright, most managers have it would be really nice. But Davy's a quiet, pleasant man, if you understand. And it's hard to get him worked up, but he's just a lovely person. Whereas Billy is Billy, they know, two completely different animals altogether. So going from one extreme, Davy, who was so nice, quiet and pleasant, to Billy, who was rant and rave. If you understand what I'm saying, you know, it was difficult. But to be fair, I was scared shit myself the first time when he walked in.
You were not?
I was, yeah, of course I was.
Really?
When he walked in.
Did he have that aura about him with all the players?
Well, a lot of the young players, obviously, he did.
Uh-huh.
You know, obviously, because he's Billy McNeil, isn't he?
Sure. Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? You're not messing around with any Muppets here, it's Big Billy. He was great, to be fair.
And if you look at the man that came in his stead, Davy Hay, an absolutely fantastic player for Celtic, a man I hugely admire, but a man running a pub in Paisley who'd been the Motherwell manager, who'd resigned that job, expecting to get a job, I think, in Detroit, certainly in the United States, and had done a bit of coaching at Chelsea. He was out of football. He had very limited managerial experience. But the board turned to him. I mean, again, that wouldn't happen these days.
And he was 34 years old?
Yeah, he was a young man. He hadn't been retired from the game all that very long, you know. And I think just probably didn't have the coaching experience to do it. Again, although had been a fantastic player, his tenure at Celtic Park was one that was... Questions were often asked about whether he would hang on to his job, fairly or unfairly. You know, he'd said in season 83, 84 that if he didn't win something that season, then he may consider quitting. The Celtic won the BP Youth Cup that season, and Davy joked to the press, "Well, we've won this, so I can stay." tongue in cheek, you know. But he hung on, and you might want to talk about the game. I don't know, and won the Scottish Cup in the 100th Cup final, the Centenary Cup final of '85. Mm-hmm. But there was a situation with Davy towards the end of his tenure where he'd said that he wanted to buy Joe McLaughlin of Chelsea, and he was also looking at Steve Bruce. Well, we all know what happened to Steve Bruce, of course. He was absolutely fantastic for Manchester United for many years, pivotal to them. And Jack McGinn had said, well, if you want to buy Steve Bruce, you'll have to, on Jim McLaughlin, you'll have to dig into your own pocket to do it. And Jack McGinn maintains that was a joke. That was an offhand way of spiking that story. And I think it probably was, but it speaks a lot again about the mentality at Celtic Park at that time.
And as you rightly say, his first year we won nothing apart from the BP Youth Cup.
Yeah.
And in 1984, of course, we lose the cup final to Aberdeen in strange circumstances, but. And we'll move on here in a minute. It did qualify us for the European Cup Winners' Cup.
Yeah, well, that campaign, that cup final against Aberdeen was a brutal cup final. It wasn't a cup final at all. It was just another meeting of the teams. Eric Black scored a very controversial goal in the first half. The Celtic players, and I've looked at it again since we talked about doing this podcast. The Celtic players say that there was 2 infringements on their players in the lead up to that goal. They're quite right. There was a lot of pushing. It was a very physical affair. Celtic got back into it 5 minutes before the end of the game by a brilliant goal from a very young Paul McStay, showed at the bottom of the net. But the major talking point about the game, Chris, was Roy Aitken being sent off in the first half for a nothing challenge, really, on Mark McGee. And I think Roy Aitken, if memory serves, was only the second player ever to be sent off at that point in the Scottish Cup final. So it was a big deal being sent off. Anyway, McGee gets the winner in extra time, and Celtic, 10 men are really on their knees. So yes, Davy Hamas is it, but of course, because Aberdeen won the league, we qualify for the Cup Winners' Cup in their place, and that, as you probably want to tee up, brings about all manner of discord.
So funny you should mention that. Yes, I do want to talk about Rapid Vienna.
I just had an inkling that was where you were going.
I remember watching these games, sitting in the house with my dad and with my brother, and over the 2 legs and thinking, yes, Celtic have done it. They've overcome, this team of cheats and, brutality and all this here kind of stuff, and thinking, yes, we've done it. And then we didn't do it.
So you're absolutely right. We're back in about November 84 here, December 84, because it all ends up finishing in December. So the whole thing starts in November, it finishes in December. But when I look back on this, I think of it, to be honest with you, as really one of the most dramatic episodes in modern Celtic history. It kind of pulled us apart as fans, and I imagine as players and as a club. It was deeply traumatic. Rapid Vienna were a bunch of thugs, frankly, and no one is going to tell me otherwise. So it was a total debacle, right? We lose 3-1 away in Vienna. But David Proven said that night that it was a bad atmosphere in Vienna. But for some unknown reason, the Austrians, or perhaps the Viennese, I don't know, the Austrians really didn't like the Scots. But on the pitch, when they went for the walkout, they sort of look at the turf and have a bit of examine the ground, that kind of thing beforehand. Proven said that there was a really nasty atmosphere, and one of the groundsmen was walking past and sort of, basically pushed them aside. And we got the feeling that they weren't welcome at Rapid by any means. So Celtic lose 3-1 on the night, but they have this wonderful, what seems like a wonderful 3-0 home victory at Celtic Park. I mean, in really classic Celtic style, coming, a European night under floodlights, they turn on the style, they win 3-0. But basically, to sum up a whole lot of events, there was a huge delay to proceedings after Celtic's third goal. I'm saying that from memory, I think that's right. And it's a delay of about 12 minutes, where one of the Rapid players is saying that he'd been injured. And at this point, we're so irate in the jungle that, unfortunately, some guy throws a bottle out of the jungle.
And it lands on the track, but unbelievably a Rapid Vienna player falls over.
Yeah, it's miles away. Now the game, just thinking about it for a second, the game was stopped because the Celtic fan throws the bottle out of the jungle, and it's the Rapid defender. I was just thinking of his name there, Weinhofer, he falls to the ground as if he's been poleaxed, really. You know, like the ball has hit him. But you can clearly see, you quite remember it from the television replays, the ball arches miles above his head. Now, Rapid, this is the interesting thing, Rapid then, they think about taking the players off the park, and the management team say, no, stay on. Right? Rapid demand then that Celtic are expelled from the Cup. They even go as far as telexing UEFA while still in Glasgow. Also, even still inside Celtic Park, right? And demanding sanctions against Celtic that the match was irregular, right? So UEFA first say this is nonsense, and they fine Rapid and they throw out these claims, right? Rapid, of course, feel they've got a case, right? And appeal. Now, the strange thing is, again, Celtic go there, I think, with Ernie Walker, and the SFA are saying, don't worry about this, this will just be thrown out. Only 3 men turn up for the appeal committee, out of, I think, about 21 that can turn up. They refuse to look at television evidence. They increase the fine for Rapid Vienna, right, for their actions at Celtic Park. But they agree that the match is irregular, and that tie should be played again at a neutral venue 150 kilometres away from Celtic Park. It's an astonishing decision.
You couldn't make it up, so you couldn't.
You can't. Now in December '84, it's an astonishing decision, right? So the whole of the Celtic support in Scotland, England, and Ireland, I think, descend upon Old Trafford, and it's just one of those terrible, terrible nights, which I'm sure you remember as well, as you say, watching on television. It was.
I remember like it was yesterday.
Yeah,
and I remember the fan getting onto the pitch and all the rest of it, and my dad tutting going, oh no, you know.
Yeah. Well, the goalie was attacked by a Celtic fan, and the goal scorer, Pack Holt, he was attacked by another Celtic supporter as he walked off the park. Now, Celtic again, in their ardour to see natural justice served, had pushed up the park, hit the post, and Danny McGrain, I think it was Aiken who hit the post, Danny McGrain was left chasing Paco back, and he was fast, and Danny wasn't the fastest, at least at that point. And they scored. It was 1-0 in the night, and Celtic lost their heads.
Yeah.
And with it, the tie. And I think that, again, was a real kick in the teeth for Davy Hay and for those players, because going back to the second leg, the original second leg, that had been a wonderful result in itself. And Rapid Vienna had done the name of football absolutely no good whatsoever. So much and so that when we played Everton in the final of that competition, well, we could rightly expect to have been. When we played them in the final of that competition, which Everton won on the night, the Everton fans held up a banner saying we should have been playing Celtic. Yeah. I mean, it's... but we did reach the Scottish Cup final of that year, in which Rapid Vienna were mentioned, and there was a banner there that simply said, "Ha ha, Rapid." And the Everton game was on the Wednesday night, and this was on the Saturday at Hampden. You know, so in a sense, the Everton meted out the justice, but we could have expected to be in that final, and again, the 80s could have been different because of that. All these things, the 80s seemed to turn on. Just the flip of a coin, as it were, just the twist of fate.
Or total corruption. Yeah. No, not total corruption. I didn't say that.
Yeah, well, certainly underhand tactics.
Okay, so I am here with Paul Cudahy of the Celtic View, and I thought it would be only appropriate that we document the history of the club newspaper as part of the Celtic History podcast. Because really, Paul, we all grew up, I mean, you and I are sort of around about the same age, we all grew up reading the Celtic View.
Exactly, yes. I mean, it predates me. I'm maybe not as old as I look, to be honest, but it kind of... it has been a part and parcel of the sort of fabric of the club, and coincided with that, the start of the great era. Jock Stein's first full season was the first season the View was there, so it kind of the timing of it being launched was just perfect as far as the newspaper was concerned.
And what was the idea behind it? Why did Celtic launch a newspaper?
I mean, I think basically the idea it came. It was Jack McGinn, who at the time was working in, I think it was the Daily Express he was working for, and he came to Celtic with this idea. And it was a combination of things. I think if you look back at newspapers in the 60s, I mean, the extent of the football coverage is nowhere near as much as it is today. And obviously, all the different platforms we've got now didn't exist. But I think there was a perception even back then that the newspapers weren't very, very favourable towards Celtic. So I think part of that was part of Jack's thinking, that basically the Celtic needed a platform and called the Celtic View, so there was a way of getting the club's message out without it being twisted or distorted, which is, I think, maybe a feeling that at the time fans thought in the general media. So he went and he just basically presented this idea of how a newspaper published by the club could work and how it would be received by the fans, and the board embraced that.
And how was it received from its inception?
I mean, I think it was really positive. I mean, one of the things I've spoke to Jack McGinn a few times about it, and I mean, I think he, obviously, the two things he's proud of is obviously he became chairman of the club, but I think the fact that this newspaper that he, had his idea back in 1965 is still going strong. I mean, not nearly 50 years later, and I think there's not that many publications that can say that. And he always says that when he presented the final thing to the board and they agreed, and I think Jockstein was there, and Jockstein had said to him, I'll guarantee a trophy in the first issue, because the first issue came out on August 11th, 1965, and we obviously had won the cup. So, Jockstein was as good as his word. And I think just the fact it was the first time that I think fans felt that the club was able to get its message across, and they maybe felt they had a platform as well at the time. I think it took off right away and was very successful.
And was it new? Was it unique? Was it a groundbreaking idea by Celtic, or was this a thing of the times, or had there been other clubs that had done something similar?
I think, as far as I know, I mean, that's one of the things that we've always, proclaimed about the Celtic View. It's the oldest club magazine / newspaper in the world, because I think Celtic were the first to do it. And as I say, I think we were maybe, again, and that's maybe where Jack McGinn saw that there was a market for it, and, for clubs to have their own platform. And even predates, as I say, the amount of football coverage now that newspapers give football is phenomenal compared to what it was back in the 60s. And I don't know if, somebody was starting one now, there would be the same market, because the newspapers cover everything so extensively. At the time they didn't. But I think Celtic were the first. We kind of led the way in terms of having our own publication.
Even when you look at today's market and the use of the internet and daily blogs and all this kind of stuff, even back then, back in the 60s and the 70s and stuff, it must have been pretty tough to keep the content fresh.
I mean, I think sometimes it's driven by, as I say, I think the guys who started it, I mean, there's no doubt that the timing was just perfect, because the very first season of The View was the first of 9 in a row, and so the reporting on our re-emergence as the domestic force in Scotland, and alongside of that, we suddenly emerge as one of the top teams in Europe. Within 2 years of The View starting, we've won the European Cup. So, in terms of the content, that's a gift, I think, for any journalist. I'm also slightly envious when I look back, and it originally started as a 4-page black and white broadsheet newspaper, so I'm thinking that might have been slightly easier to fill than the magazine that we do just now. But to be able to write and report on those great players and obviously great manager, great games and success, I think that's what you would want as a fan as much as a journalist as well.
And what about the people that actually wrote for the newspaper as it was at the time? I mean, were they hired? Were they freelance journalists? Were they just people about Celtic? What was their profiles?
Well, I mean, Jack was the first, the editor. I mean, he was the editor for a good few years, I think up until the late 70s. John McPhail, again, former Celtic player, he wrote for the magazine, or for the newspaper at the time. And I say, when you look back on the content, it wasn't what we would see now in terms of either a newspaper or a magazine. Very, a lot of articles and a lot of different features. It didn't have that kind of same intensity, and so maybe it would have been slightly easier, I suppose, to produce it, but it's very much an in-house thing for years and years, and that's, as I say, Jack McGinn was in charge as the editor until about 1979, I think it was.
And then when Jack McGinn then sort of moved on within the club, did the view change? Obviously this sort of very big personality within the club had his stamp all over the Celtic view. But when he moved on, did that sort of change a little bit? Was there more freedom for any of the raiders and the guys that were involved in it at the time to be a little bit more expressive?
I mean, Jack was obviously still involved with the club, so he would have still taken a real interest in it. And over the years, they've had various journalists who've been there as editors. It's always a very, very small staff, editorial staff that's worked on the magazine, and generally they've, probably not long after say Jack's tenure as editor, that would have been when the View would start to be known as Pravda. That would have kicked in. So it was always very much. As a previous Celtic View editor said, I think it was Andrew Smith, when he was interviewed for one of the DVDs, he says the clue's in the title, it's the Celtic View. So I think always it's had to reflect the club's position, and at times that can be difficult for the magazine. It can be difficult for us because you're having to keep so many, you're trying to appeal to supporters who are going to buy the magazine. You're having to obviously keep, for example, the players and managers at various times on board because they're the ones that provide the content, and over and above that, you've obviously, because it is the club magazine, you have to maintain that kind of line. And I think that if you look back through the Celtic View, that's always been the case. There's been slight variations along the way of maybe being a wee bit more flexible, and that sometimes that worked, sometimes it didn't, but because it's always been the official club magazine, it's always had to, that's always what it's had to do.
And you mentioned the Pravda side of things. When Not the View came out as one of the fanzines, one of the first Celtic fanzines, and obviously challenged the Celtic View as it was at the time. When you look back at that in hindsight now, there was probably room for both and a necessity for both.
I must admit, I mean, you mentioned right at the start about maybe us being of a similar vintage. I love the Not the View because at that time in the kind of mid-80s when that appeared, and it was just, I suppose, particularly for supporters, and it was as much railing against, I think, the club and the old board, and obviously it was just a clever play on the title of the View, but it was really funny, and it was. I think fanzines have always had their place, and particularly when maybe things haven't been going so well either on or off the park. I think that's maybe when they've thrived, because they've maybe given fans, certainly in the pre-internet era, a bit more of an outlet, not only to voice maybe their opinion, but also just doing it with a wee bit more humour at times that maybe we are constrained by. So I think the Not the View was, I must admit, I would have bought it at the time and going to games, so I always have a lot of time for it.
Even when I think one of the main concerns of the fans at the time, obviously we're talking about going through the sack the board days and all this here kind of stuff. When you read back to some of the letters that were in the View at the time, there was a huge amount of scepticism as to whether they were real letters or not.
It's difficult, and I think in terms of the people who would have ran the View at that time, because particularly if you take maybe say the late 80s and early 90s, when obviously things were really bad on the field, but more than that, the fans were mobilising and the whole kind of Celts for Change movement was on the go, and things were happening behind the scenes because it was getting quite serious here. Then again, because going back to what I was saying earlier about the Celtic View being the club magazine, then it's difficult for the club. And there are some classic Celtic View covers from that time. I think the one that people always bang on about was the one for was it the Canvas Lang project? That classic. So at that time, I think I'm not sure if it was Kevin Kelly standing in a field, and so the club. Obviously the club's putting its view out through the Celtic View, and the fact that you had fanzines, I think, helped in terms of fans being able to have an alternative platform. And probably, as I say, I think it was always quite a clever way that we were labelled as Pravda, but to an extent your hands are tied, because you are the magazine of the club, and that's always been the case.
So when Fergus took over, was the magazine revamped in any way? Was it modernised with more your more intelligent fan now, who's out there writing these fanzines with that type of readership in mind? Yeah, I mean, I think there was two of the kind of main in terms of the evolution of the View. I mean, back in 1990, it kind of went colour for the first time. And again, that's a classic front cover, because it was Martin Hayes on the front cover, which is just, maybe not one of our legendary players, but it kind of stayed as a newspaper. And then even after Fergus came in, it was still sort of newspaper until the sort of late 70s. But probably that was certainly in those few years that there was maybe a sense of maybe trying to embrace to an extent some of the fanzine type culture when you see some of the content at that time. So there was maybe a wee bit more, they maybe wanted to try and meet the fanzines halfway. So there was some columnists in who were maybe given a wee bit more leeway than they had done under the old board. And no doubt during that period, I'm sure the View had seen a drop in numbers of sales. Would that be back to anywhere near what it was today? I mean, it's always, to be fair, it's always fluctuated by and large, depending on how the team are doing. It's always been, because it's one of those things that you obviously can't control when you're in here. You can produce the magazine every week, and some weeks you would produce a magazine and you think this is, there's a lot of really good stuff in here, and then we would get a disappointing result at the weekend, and that's, by the time the magazines come out, that's reflected in the sales. Conversely, if you bring out the magazine and we've, maybe in the past when we would have had a derby win, for example, then you get a real lift for that, because obviously that means there's a feel-good factor. Fans want to read about that, etc. So that's still reflected in the sales. There's no doubt that I think, like every publication, things like more than the fanzines, things like the internet, for example, with message boards, and then obviously social media, and the whole kind of 24-hour news culture, that I think that affects every physical publication, whether it's the Celtic View or whether it's newspapers or magazines. So it's always a case of trying to think how we kind of embrace that as well. See the Celtic team that night? This is one of the Celtic teams that I always remember. Mm-hmm. I'll read it out to you. Yeah, go for it. Packie Bonner, Willie McStay, Murdo McLeod, Aitken, McAdam, Grant, Proven, Paul McStay, Brad McClure, Tommy Burns, Frank McGarvey. What a bloody brilliant team. Oh, absolutely brilliant team. That was my superior team. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Peter Grant must have been pretty young when I think about that, Absolutely, great team. And I think, again, Celtic had some absolutely wonderful players. If you could pick a select of the 80s, what a team that would be. What a team. You could go back for a moment, just for a moment, to the Real Madrid game. Bobby Lennox played in that second leg in the Bernabeu. He played in the Scottish Cup final in 1980. You could put Bobby Lennox. He's on the front of the programme. I have it sitting right beside me. yeah. You could have a wonderful team in the 80s. But as we've discussed, strength and depth was not the forte there. Peter Grant and Paul McStay were very young coming through. Just fantastic players. And that then leads us on, Douglas, to the 1985 Centenary Cup final. I remember it well. Oh, what a day that was. Yeah, incredible. Celtic 2, Dundee United 1. Absolutely. I remember it for lots of reasons. I remember it being very overcast. I remember paying £1 at the Bhoys gate to get in. I'm not sure I was still qualified for the Bhoys gate, but it was £1 to get into the Scottish Cup final. And I remember it being incredibly busy. Now, I'd always thought the reason it was busy was that there was a crowd surge because so many people had turned up because it was pay at the gate.
And we had a new system at Hampden because it had a very minor revamp at that Celtic end. We basically put a new sort of toilet block on the top. And the police had opened the wrong gates because they didn't know what they were doing. Now, that was a story I'd heard on the day of the game. Just didn't remember it. But what I've heard since was that some wise soul in Strathclyde police had seen that there was a crush about to happen. And I don't often say this about the police. And had opened the gates on his command. And it tells us again, thinking about the context of the 80s, that Hillsborough was bound to happen. But there were times where, I was at Hampden and I'd been lifted clean off my feet, Celtic Part 2. There was a real crush that day, and people were getting very angry and very drunk. And again, you think about young fans perhaps listening to this podcast, I remember standing about halfway down the traditional Celtic end on that curve of Hampden, and bottles flying down over my head that were intended to hit the police at the bottom, but were getting nowhere near the police. Mm-hmm. They were landing in the Celtic end. These black missiles, empty bottles of beer, empty bottles of wine, empty bottles of goodness knows what. And it's a very different world to that. I remember the crush when they scored. I remember the relief. I remember Beattie scoring in the first half. But most of all, I remember Roy Aitken and that proven free kick. Archie McPherson, being a boy, you remember these things. I think boys remember it more than girls. I'm sure some Celtic sporting girls would remember this commentary too. But I remember Archie McPherson saying, Davy Proven, with that one kick alone, brought Celtic back into this match when it looked as though they were dying on their feet. And then he says for the second goal, so that came up with about 15 minutes to go, and he says for the second goal, Aitken, good drifting ball, McGarvey, it's there! And McGarvey, Fran McGarvey, God bless him, what a player, Aitken thundered in a cross. It was not a subtle cross by any means. It was a power cross, if such a term exists in football. And McGarvey just sort of threw himself through the air and got his head to the ball, and I'm not sure he could even steer it. It's travelling so hard, but it flew past Hamish McAlpin into the top of the net anyway. And we won the 100th Scottish Cup. And then McPherson says, there he is, Davy Hay, he survived. He really is one of the gentlemen of the sport, always so calm, sometimes a little bit tense and calm. But these memories are very fresh to me, But there was a rawness, a wildness about Celtic, an unpredictability at that time. And we've talked about it a lot in this little chat already, that they could be fantastic, or they could be suckered into some great, tragic comedy like Rapid Vienna, or they could be Ajax, or they could be Real Madrid, but lose the second.
But it's the romance, Douglas. It was the Centenary Cup final, and we scored with 5 minutes before the end. That is Absolutely. Celtic in a nutshell.
And it is. And yet, Chris, for all the romance, and of course, you think about 88 still to come, still to talk about. For all the romance, I would still want to have a team that you could send out where you'd think, this team can play, this team will win, this team doesn't have to rely on this last-minute surge. But you're right, it is part of the Celtic lore. It is part of the Celtic tradition. But I don't want to be an old man suffering a heart attack every time I watch Celtic.
Celtic first, and Celtic last, and Celtic overall.
Season 1982-83 would prove to be a watershed campaign for the Bhoys. The League Cup was claimed after a 2-1 victory over Rangers, and in the European Cup, a memorable victory was achieved in Amsterdam against Ajax and Johan Cruyff. In the league, Celtic once more let a commanding lead slip away, allowing Dundee United and Aberdeen back into contention. Come the last weekend, Celtic had to hope results elsewhere went their way. Despite a dramatic 4-2 final day victory at Ibrox, it was United who ended the day as champions. More pain was to follow. The indebted star of Celtic's campaign was the blossoming talent of Nicholas. Having recovered from a broken leg, the striker had enjoyed a remarkable season, hitting 48 goals. His goal count was eye-catching enough, but coupled with his natural confidence and style, It was little wonder the player had become the hottest property in British football. The Parkhead support viewed the talent of Nicholas as a foundation of future success. But with the major English clubs prowling, the Celtic board had other ideas. Nicholas was sold to Arsenal for a reported £625,000. Given interest from the then dominant Liverpool, it was a surprising destination, but that was of little consequence to distraught support. A support which would be soon dealt a double blow when manager Billy McNeill decided to follow Nicholas south. Irked by financial restrictions and the attitude of the board, the manager had been the subject of a very public fallout with chairman Desmond White. The departure of Nicholas would be the final straw. McNeill would leave in acrimonious terms for Man City. His replacement in the Parkhead dugout would be former teammate Davy Hay. Given a relative lack of experience, the ex-Motherwell manager was a surprise choice, and his first term would see Celtic finish runners-up in every domestic competition. In the final of the Scottish Cup, Roy Aitken would be sent off, as Aberdeen sealed a fortunate extra-time victory and the double. The following campaign would see the Celts take on Austria's Rapid Vienna in the second round of the 1984-85 European Cup Winners' Cup. In an often ill-tempered first leg, Rapid grabbed a 3-1 advantage from a match in which Celtic were reduced to 10 men after the harsh sending off of Alan McInally. Celtic would dominate the return in front of a packed Parkhead. The home side swept to a 2-0 half-time lead and made it 3-0 after the break. With the European exit now looming, the side from Vienna could only muster the most vulgar responses. Rapid's Kainas was sent off for punching Tommy Burns. With the game entering its closing stages, the midfielder was again the victim when the visitors' keeper kicked out at the player. With the match bubbling well beyond boiling point, a near 15-minute delay followed, as Rapid players protested for the award of a penalty. It was at this time a bottle was seen to be thrown onto the field of play. The missile landed harmlessly on the turf, but sensing one final chance to derail Celtic's progress, Vienna's Weinhofer collapsed, holding his head. He was stretchered off, his head theatrically wrapped in bandages. The missile incident would overshadow a wonderful victory. The Austrian club quickly lodged a complaint, but this was dismissed by UEFA's disciplinary committee. Almost immediately, Rapid began lobbying the UEFA officials, and an appeal was submitted. Incredulously, and against all the evidence, a hastily arranged appeal panel ruled Weinhofer had indeed been hit by a missile. The match was ordered to be replayed at a venue at least 100 miles from Celtic Park. It was a staggering decision. A crowd of 51,000 would pack into Manchester United's Old Trafford ground to witness Rapid steal a 1-0 victory. The atmosphere was both volatile and poisonous, but there could be no excuse for the attacks which were launched into Vienna players by supposed Celtic fans. Celtic exited Europe with the reputation of their support severely damaged. The vile Rapid progressed to the final. Domestically, a second successive trophyless season would be averted, when a stunning Davy Provan free kick and a late diving header from Frank McGarvey sealed a famous final comeback as the Boys lifted the Scottish Cup with a 2-1 victory over Dundee United.
It's Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic over all.
I can take it as a young man.
But Douglas, it's the same today. You know, the referee's assistant puts up, 3 minutes left to go, and there's this big surge. And but you're shouting with 15 minutes to go. For God's sake, don't wait for 3 minutes to go before you start attacking.
I know. And if ever there was a decade that summed up that kind of mentality, that we'll just wait. We'll just wait. Until that. We'll take our time in doing it. It was this decade. It was the 80s. It was bonkers.
If Celtic were to release a DVD of the last 3 minutes of every game throughout the 80s, you'd pretty much get all the good stuff.
There'd be people buying that over the planet just for the terror of it. You know, nothing to do with football, just edge of the seat stuff.
They never win things easily, do they, Celtic? They keep you waiting right till the end. I think that's why we love them all so much. They'll put you through the wrangler.
Absolutely. That's it, exactly. Let's face it, they're never going to be like, although Barcelona do it too, I've seen them do it once or twice, but they're never going to be like a team of Galacticos who can go out and steamroll people, you know, every time they play. It just wouldn't be part of the Celtic way.
So where would the fun be in that?
No, exactly.
Talking about fun, we haven't even talked about Love Street yet.
No, I know. I mean, that seems incredible. That seems incredible. So, the Love Street is the end of the following season, right?
Yes, it is.
You know, after the drama of the cup final, Celtic start the next season. Obviously, Davy Hay needs to win a championship. He's won the Scottish Cup, but he needs to win a championship to sort of really stay in his job. That's what the media are saying. They're probably right, actually. They're not always right by any means, but they're probably right. So, my memory of it is this. The Celtic start very badly. But so do Hearts. Hearts emerge as the front runners, but they start poorly too and then get a great run going. And Celtic follow them with a good run as well. But no one is really looking at Celtic. The story is Hearts. The media narrative is Hearts. Hearts, you know, they're Hearts. Hearts lasted from the 50s. And it all boils down to this. On the last day of the season, Celtic are in second place. They go to places in Love Street, and they need to win by 3 clear goals or
That's
better.
Right. Uh-huh.
And Hearts go to Dens Park and require only a point. And at this point, Hearts had gone, goodness knows how many games, 15 or 16 unbeaten, but no one's talking about this at the same time. So have Celtic. And many of them have been wins in Celtic's case, whereas Hearts had really stuttered. I think they had
the championship was won in March for Hearts.
Well, that's right.
It's all over.
According to the media, that's right. But Hearts start to stutter about this period. They have one or two little hiccups, like a draw here or a win over Falkirk or someone like that. You know, in the last sort of couple of weeks of the championship, and it's just nerves and inexperience on their part, and they're actually trying to believe that they're in this position. Hell of a lot of pressure on Hearts. Pressure on Celtic too, because there's always pressure on Celtic. Anyway, we go to Love Street and win 5-0. And score some great goals in the process, by the way.
Fantastic goals. If anybody hasn't seen it, go and watch them.
Oh, I mean, there's a goal that, I think it's the third goal, that starts from Danny McGrain. McGrain gives it to, it goes to about 5-7 players. McGrain gives it to McStay, who gives it to, who returns it to McGrain, who gives it to McLeod, I think it was, and then back out to McStay again, who gives it to McLeod, who sticks it between one guy's legs, who goes round another, and who scores it for Mo Johnston, who just appears from nowhere and tucks it into the net. And it's a flowing move that would be worthy of any of the great teams that have ever played the game, frankly. And it's on a pretty wet pitch at that time, you know. Anyway, to cut a long story short, and it's a story that we'll talk about for generations, I'm sure. The St Mirren goalie has got the ball and is just about to take a goal kick. And behind him, and the whole ground is full of Celtic supporters. You know? The Celtic end behind them, one of the 3 or 4 Celtic ends, erupts. And Jock Brown, who I watched it again recently, says, in rather flat tones, hardly getting excited about it, I wonder why. Call me cynical, you know. Says, and that seems to be the news from Dens Park, that Dundee are ahead. You know? And the Celtic fans are going ballistic behind them. Right enough. Meanwhile, well, you know, I don't know what your memories of it are, but in Dundee, all hell is breaking loose.
Poor old Hearts, eh?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Albert Kidd pops up with 1 goal, and then a few minutes later, and Hearts at this point was devastated because they just need a point. You know, and they just couldn't break Dundee down. Albert Kidd pops up with a second. Albert Kidd, a Celtic fan, a substitute on the day at Dundee.
The best Celtic player that never played for Celtic.
Aye, Aye, and won the league for Celtic. Well, of course, the Celtic players had won the league for Celtic because they'd done their bit of the bargain and more. And so when the final whistle goes, you watch these scenes, it's so ballistic at Love Street, you know, and the players can hardly get off for being mobbed. They can hardly get back on again because they can't get Celtic fans off, you know. And it's just one, again, it's just one of these episodes of Celtic's history where they've left it very last minute. But the difference here, I think, is they've done it against the odds.
Mm-hmm.
It truly is a remarkable achievement. They've done it completely, utterly against the odds. And people talk now about, isn't it a shame that Hearts lost? And to an extent, for that club, for those fans, the disappointment must have been terrible. But the credit must go to the team that won the league. And the credit must go to Celtic for that performance and for the run they put together.
From 1980 through to 1982, the home shirt still had a white V-neck collar, but introduced to the green and white hooped home shirt for the first time was the Celtic crest. This was placed on the left breast and the Umbro sponsorship details on the right breast. Long sleeves would be available for players to wear, and these are complemented with white cuffs. White shorts and white socks finished off the home kit during this time. 1982 seen a change in the home kit dynamics in that went to the period where the style of shirt would change every couple of years. From 82 to 84 seen a couple of subtle changes to the Celtic home kit. Along with the white shorts and socks, the V-neck stayed, but this time with a green middle surrounded by white edges. A green hoop was also added round the cuffs in each arm. 83 to 84 seen Celtic wear the exact same style of home kit, but much to the dismay of the shirt traditionalists, a change came in the form of shirt advertising being introduced to the kit. A white panel with a black C.R. Smith logo was plastered along the middle of the home kit, which would kick off a long-term relationship with C.R. Smith. 85 to 87 seen a slight change in the home kit. Out went the V-neck and in came a rounded collar. 87 to 89 saw the Centenary strip released, which bore a Celtic cross crest instead of our shamrock. The shorts also seen the introduction of the club's usual shamrock crest added to the shorts. White cuffs and white socks complemented the kit worn during the double of 1988. From 89 to 90, out went the rounded collar to be replaced by a winged button collar. The style of hoop stayed the same, but this shirt became the first to feature some shadow patterning, which was a fine zigzag pattern appearing throughout the hoops. White shorts and white socks complemented the home kit.
Upon my chest, it's such a joy for us to see, for they play football the Celtic way.
Welcome back. The time is 6 minutes past 5. Time for a special BBC production. On the fall of the Berlin Wall. In the past 3 days, the world has seen the city transformed. One divided by a cruel wall, to one where its citizens from east and west may come and go as they please. Freedoms taken for granted in the west have caused a culture shock in the east, and the process continues. Crossings are now opening up along the border, and we go live to the Brandenburg Gate for a special report with Adolf Brickenbauer. Can you hear me, Adolf?
Yeah, okay, I hear you. Let me describe what I'm seeing here. There is a large crowd either side of the wall with construction equipment. And there is a young boy standing on his father's shoulders, 6 to 8 years of age, clutching einen Schlaghammer. Und he is bashing and crashing and smashing away at the wall. And as he strikes, it is as if he is tenderizing einen Schnitzel. As the graffiti-covered wall crumbles away, the fatherland is once again united. I feel as though Germany will continue to be an industrial powerhouse. The main difference will be that our people are happier. This is quite an atmosphere at Unter den Lindenstrasse. Back to you, Trevor.
Thank you, Mr. Brickenbauer.
A truly momentous occasion for both Germany's, Europe and the world.
The one thing that I always think about when I think of Love Street is for any of the younger listeners that don't remember these days and they grew up on stories about Mo Johnson being a Judas and going to Rangers and all that.
Yeah.
Just watch Mo Johnson at Love Street and you'll understand why we were so mad that he didn't sign again for Celtic.
It's an exceptionally good point because, Mo Johnson was a cracking player. You talk to Frank McAvenny, for instance, and he tell you how good a player Mo Johnston was. He was confident, Maurice Johnston, and he brought a lot of confidence to the team. He scored a lot of goals, and he loved playing for Celtic, quite clearly. Between you and I, and all your listeners, Brian McClare was my favourite, and I always felt that he was more of a thinking player. But Mo Johnston, was celebrity. He was stardust. He was a goal scorer. He was brilliant. And he was great on that day, as you rightly say.
You know what's funny about this? You think you're over Mo Johnson, and then you start talking about it, and you start thinking about the Love Street, and I'm still not over the Mo Johnson thing. And if Graham Souness done it just to cheese me off, well done, Graham. Mission accomplished. I'm still raging all these years later.
I know. All these, it's absolutely right. And sometimes I think to myself, you could do it. I wonder if anyone's written Mo Johnson's biography. I wonder if you do an article about Mo Johnson. I wonder if he would talk these days frankly about what happened. And I think to myself, no, I can't bring myself to do that. It's ridiculously pathetic in some ways. But
actually, when I lived in America, I toyed with the idea of trying to get him on the podcast. Back in the days of, there was only Lost Boys and there was Celtic Underground, and we're doing trying to do different things and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And Mo at this stage, of course, was coaching in North America. I think it was Toronto or something at the time.
That's right, he was for a while.
And he was coming down to Houston. I thought, I'm going to try and get Mo Johnson on the podcast. And Big Jerry, who does the podcast with us, was like, Chris, please don't. Please don't.
it would have been, I tell you what, it would have been a controversial choice, as you rightly suggest, but it would have been a real coup as well to get him on.
I think I would have lost a rag, Douglas.
Yeah, you start off all professional and asking him, what was it? But then you'd be bloody furious.
The bleep button would go into overdrive, so it was total beep. Why'd you do it?
I know. And I think all of us would, no matter how much we think we might be able to sort of temper things, as kind of any kind of realm of broadcasting or journalism or whatever it might be, media stuff, we would all feel a bit like that. It would be a hard job to try and sort of keep that in. I was just thinking, as we were talking, I've got my book here, the Pocketbook Celtic, and I looked up Maurice Johnston, 1986, Scottish Premier League recent man. Great goals. So it's McGrain to McStay, McStay to Aitken, Aitken to McGrain, McGrain to McClare, McClare beats a man and centres for Johnston. And that's the goal. And that's the goal you should watch on YouTube because it is fantastic. No matter what he did, fine footballer. And that's why we hurt about it even still.
I'm not talking about him anymore. I'm getting grumpy.
I knew there would be joy and sorrow in the 80s.
So that brings us very conveniently up to about 1987. Yeah. And we probably should talk a little bit about the change in Scottish football in 1987 with the arrival of Graham Souness.
Yeah, well, again, correct me if I'm wrong when I say this, and I'll say it now. And you'll know the major change, a huge change that is still around and still with us now to some extent, is when Rangers decided under David Holmes to appoint Graham Souness as manager. Souness, who had led Liverpool to 3 European titles. Souness, who had gone off to play for Sampdoria. Souness, who had said in an interview that his ambition in football remaining was to be player manager of Rangers.
Souness back when we liked them.
So, yeah, exactly. Souness, who, if I'm wrong, I'm sure many Celtic fans will correct me on this. Souness, who had played for Celtic Boys Club. or at least had appeared, at least had been considered for Celtic Boys Club. No one talks about that either. A long, long time ago. So Souness comes in, and Rangers start to do something very clever. They put money into Souness as manager. On the back of the Heysel disaster, European English clubs are banned from Europe. So major English players can't get a game in Europe. Their European careers are stymied other than in their international jerseys. So Rangers have got money, and they say to people like Terry Butcher, Graham Roberts and Chris Woods, come, we'll pay you X. You know, you can play in Europe. You have these grand ambitions. You can live a lovely lifestyle in Scotland on the outskirts of Glasgow or Lomond or wherever you fancy. You'll win medals. You know, it's a great lifestyle. It's good fun. You know, you'll have great games here against Celtic, etc., etc. It becomes known as the Rangers Revolution, and the media really, really buys into that narrative. Celtic have a 9-point lead at the top of the table, I think, on New Year's Day, 86-87 season. And that slips completely by the end of the season, and Rangers are champions in Souness's first season in charge. But they also win the League Cup in that season. That's his first major honour.
And we can ring our conspiracy bell for the League Cup final?
Yeah, absolutely. And they beat Celtic 2-1. That day, Brian McClare scores an absolutely fantastic equaliser for Celtic. Thunders it into the top of the net at Hampden. Rangers scored the winner. Ian Durrant is fouled. Well, about 5 minutes to go. Not much of a foul in the box. Roy Aitken again. And Davy Cooper takes the penalty 2-1. But the real talking point is Mo Johnston getting sent off. He makes the sign of the cross to the Rangers support. For an intended headbutt, I think was the offence, and off he trots.
As I said, I used to love Mo Johnson.
Of course, off he trots, never to be heard of again. Off he trots. And in the ensuing melee, there's a remarkable Tony Shepherd, who I really like Tony Shepherd.
Tony Shepherd,
I thought he could have been a good. There was a night we played Dinamo Kiev in the mid '80s in the European Cup. He had a fine game, and I thought this guy would go on to be a really good midfielder. He ended up playing for Carlisle, I think. But Tony Shepherd just stopped going off down that track for a second. Tony Shepherd is standing behind the referee, Bob Valentine or Davy Syme, I forget which, but one of these guys. Davy Syme always took these games. Davy Syme's father had played in goal for Celtic. Again, I'm going off on one, but anyway, Davy Syme is the referee. He gets hit in the back. He gets hit in the back of the head. He turns around and he thinks Tony Shepherd lost the rag and hit him. The linesman says, "Look in the ground. There's a £50 piece or whatever it was. You know, it was a coin. So it was someone had thrown the coin at it. And so Syme had already carded Shepherd straight red. Told him to come back on." and after that, Davy Hay is so incensed by the whole thing. He says, I would have Celtic playing in the English League now.
That was the first time I ever heard of Celtic wanting to go to the English League, was when Davy Hay came out with that outburst after that.
Yes, that was the first time I'd heard of it as well. But it shows you the tension that Davy Hay was living under. But to some extent, it shows you the kind of cultural tensions that you still had in Scotland at that time, where Celtic and Celtic supporters were still seen as outsiders, I think, to some extent, perhaps in the way that they're not now, or not to that extent. Mm-hmm. Just thinking about the cultural dimension of the 80s and what a tribal time it was. And that was a remarkable thing for Hay to say, but I think, moreover, it speaks about him as a man on the edge of reason, about living under great stress and seeing certainly the better team on the day, seeing his side defeated in a fairly unwarranted fashion.
And Celtic had 7 yellow cards and 1 red card that night.
Yeah, Celtic did.
Yeah.
Well, maybe they just were the better team, but that's not my but that's not my memory of it. But it was just one of those horrible matches. But it lives long in the memory again. Yeah.
We ended up that year then trophyless again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we were playing Falkirk on the last day of the season and lost, while Rangers were winning at Pittodrie to win the league. Now, at that point, the inevitable happens, of course. Davy Hay loses his job. But he doesn't know that. He's telling the press 2 days before he's sacked about his plans for the next season.